I'm delighted to introduce our two speakers for today. Dora Betherbreed, who is a curator for international collections at the National Library of Scotland. She co-curated the Fitba Research Club Andrew Watson's Legacies project, and recently she also worked with community researchers to co-curate the exhibition Blood, Sweat and Tears, Scotland's HIV story. And Patrick Hart, who is curator for communities and organizations at the National Library of Scotland. He co-curated the Fitba Research Club, Andrew Watson's Legacies project, and among other work, he's currently supervising a collaborative doctoral project looking at how libraries can support publishing by refugees and other migrants. And their presentation uses an introduction to Fitba Research Club Andrew Watson's Legacies, a prize-winning co-curated community research project run at the National Library of Scotland in 2023 to 2024, as a way of thinking through some of the challenges and opportunities of community for research libraries and other cultural institutions. And at this point, without any further delay, I would just like to hand over to our speakers, Dora and Patrick. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Christina.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for coming along to hear what we've got to say. So today, as Christina was saying, we're going to talk about Fitba Research Club, Andrew Watson's Legacies. This was a co-curated community research project that we ran at the National Library of Scotland in 2023-24. The project brought together a team of young adult community curators, some of whom you can see on the screen there, from minoritized communities to explore the story of Scotland's and the world's first Black international football captain, Andrew Watson. The project aimed to help the participants develop research skills and information literacy, and to explore and celebrate the rich history of sporting achievement by Black people and people of colour in Scotland through the National Library's collections and through other resources. So what we'd especially like to do today is to share with you how the project both challenged and opened up our thinking around what community means. We'd also like to start a conversation, perhaps, about how we should be thinking of community when we're planning future work to make our collections and our libraries more inclusive. So I'll say a little bit about some ideas about community and some debates around community. Then I'll hand over to Dora, who will talk a little bit more about the project, and then we'll try and bring these two strands together in the final part of our talk. So community is often invoked in library discourse as an unequivocal good. And Dora, if we could have the next slide. It's here we can see it's even presented as the definition or the pinnacle of what libraries are all about. And so here we have, just as an example, a quote that's been transformed by a librarianship studies blog into a sort of, a motivational image. Bad libraries build collections, good libraries build services, great libraries build communities. Now, thinking in terms of communities tends to be central to libraries' efforts to become more inclusive. Typically, this involves identifying groups of people that in various ways have been underserved, under or misrepresented, habitually excluded, or worse. And so we talk now, I think, as a matter of habit, of the LGBTQ community, the refugee community, the gaming community, the Arabic-speaking community, and so on. And of course, this kind of use brings together communities of race and ethnicity, of interest, of language, of sexual preference, and so on. All groups held together by something in common. And I think community has become at this point a largely sort of uncontested, unquestioned term across the cultural heritage sector and across libraries. And I think this use and this approach has informed a huge amount of incredibly valuable work in libraries. And RLUK talks, past talks, have really highlighted some nice examples of sort of projects that think of community in these terms. But I think it is a the idea of community and the discourse of community does need interrogation. And at the moment, in particular, it's fiercely politically contested. For me, a sort of a kind of awakening moment in my thinking about community came at the New Scots Conference in November 2022 in Glasgow, where I was at a sort of round table talking with a group, and there was lots of very positive talk about communities and community work and what different projects people were doing. When a Palestinian PhD student, who unfortunately I didn't get her name, and I've tried to trace her and haven't succeeded, but she intervened and argued passionately and strongly that community is too often used to hold certain groups at a distance, that too often it's patronizing, it becomes a kind of paternalistic platitude. What she wanted was access to and a voice in national institutions, in what we might call the public sphere. She argued that you're only considered to be in a community if you don't have real power, or you're placed in one, you're categorized in one, if you're in a position where you're threatening to take, to get your hands on some kind of power, some kind of influence. So she really made me think about how community and the language, the discourse of community can be used as a sort of vehicle of containment. And I think sometimes consciously, but maybe much more often unconsciously, with perhaps the best of intentions. Now, this isn't a sort of incredibly new idea. Over 20 years ago, Miranda Joseph, who worked on queer theatre groups and communities in San Francisco, she was warning in her book against the romance of community, of the dangers of fetishizing community. Dora, could we have the next slide, please? So Joseph argues that fetishizing community only makes us blind to the ways we might intervene in the enactment of domination and exploitation. She goes on to argue that capitalism and more generally modernity depend on and generate discourse of community to legitimate social hierarchies. So Joseph really attacks this idea of this use of community as a sort of fuzzy, feel-good buzzword that really serves to protect us from thinking about what's really going on, about power relations and the role of capital. And these critiques of community are still coming strong. More recently, in a book published just last year, the theorist, writer Todd McGowan attacks the idea of community. He opposes community in what I would argue is quite a crude sort of binarism to what he calls the public, following Jürgen Habermas and his idea of the public sphere. So for McGowan, it's in the public sphere that we encounter each other with only our alienation in common. And he's very interested in alienation. And by that, he means our internal foreignness to ourselves and our given communities. He argues that, in contrast, communities form around the effort to avoid the problem of alienation, which he sees as an always doomed retreat from an uncomfortable truth. For McGowan, and this is the quote on the slide, the problem with an investment in community is that it encourages us to turn away from the pinch of alienation rather than recognize ourselves in this discomfort. Now, I think, as I've said, I think McGowan's sort of binary opposition of community to the public sphere is crude, much cruder than the PhD student I met at the New Scots Conference. And I think he gets community all wrong. But his book, and in particular his chapter on community, is really useful for forcing those of us who do in some sense believe in the importance of community to really articulate what we mean by it, and to think through what's important and valuable about community today. Excuse me. So it does sometimes feel like what emerges from the huge body of theoretical literature on community in sort of political science, philosophy, various sort of academic fields, is that perhaps we don't really know what we're talking about at all when we talk of community. We just think we do. In an essay titled "Where is the Bruegel Village?" Sudipta Kaviraj has asked, this is a recent essay published a few years ago, but has already proved quite influential. He asks whether community in the old sense of belonging, which he sees sort of encapsulated in Bruegel's paintings of 16th century rural life. And Dora, I think we've got one such image on the next slide. So he asks whether community is really possible at all in a post-industrial globalized world where communities' traditional core functions are performed by, or at least delegated to, the state or to private enterprise. And he asks whether community can only exist inside what he calls substructures, in small, close local institutions within a capitalist economy and a bureaucratic state. But he really, as was seen in this quotation, for him, the pressing question still is not how can we create community, but when are we a community? I won't read that whole quote, but the question for him is, what is the community? Can we live in a Bruegel village with social security and solar power in the 21st century? The Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito offers one answer to Caviraj's question, when are we a community, that I think I find very interesting, and it's helped me think through, I think helped us both think through what actually happened in our project, and how did it work, how did it not. For Esposito, it's a mistake to link the idea of community to that of belonging, identity, and ownership. So that community is identified with one's own ethnic group, with a particular land or a particular language. Instead, he argues that community is found in what is not one's own. And it's a difficult idea that he and his writing is quite challenging, but I think the idea is worth exploring. Dora, I hope somebody's pointed we don't have an Esposito slide. Is the one to come? There we go. Thank you. Just a quote and a reference there. He asks, what else is community if not the lack of one's own? For Esposito, community is found precisely in a kind of not belonging together, a giving up of belonging together, and of our given or assumed identities. So I think there is a kind of connection perhaps to McGowan's much cruder idea of the public here. For Esposito, community happens when people come together with a willingness not to own, not to have something in common that they enclose, but come to disrupt the rigid boundaries that protect an individual's identity. So rather than locking subjects within a group, he sees community is experienced in and through an opening and exposure that turns individuals inside out. Now, this is a much more kind of sort of fleeting notion of community, and Esposito's model, which is difficult to untangle, is not one that can be easily be translated into policy, and perhaps even it's difficult to think what the practical implications of it are, although that's something we will come back to. But we did find that this idea of a not belonging together had a kind of explanatory power for us when we were looking at our project. And it seems one that is worth exploring further. So that's been a bit of a whirlwind tour through some contemporary thinking around the idea of community and some reasons we might want to think more carefully about what we actually mean when we talk of it. We're not suggesting that we should throw out our sort of existing conceptions of community by any means, but we think it's worth trying to sort of push at the edges of those ideas. So with that, I'll hand over to Dora, who will talk in a bit more detail about the actual project. Thank you. Dora, over to you.
Thank you. So here's a little visual overview of our project and the people who inspired it and who were involved in it. So Andrew Watson, who you can see there in the centre of the image, in 1881 became Scotland and the world's first Black international footballer. He was born in Demerara in what was then British Guyana to a Guyanese mother and to a white Scottish plantation-owning father. He was sent to Britain as a child, briefly put in an appearance as a student at Glasgow University before dropping out, probably to play football and begin his own business. He played for famous Glasgow clubs and is one of the Scotch professors, as they were called, who are credited with taking the football kind of passing style down to England. So he was the historical figure that inspired the work, his story, his complex story. Yes, so here's Malik, our consultant co-curator. He's an author, a historian, and a performance poet, and he's about to publish his second book, which is called Searching for My Slave Roots, From Guyana's Sugar Plantations to Cambridge. And this tells the story of his family history research, which reveals how he is related to Andrew Watson. He's an ancestral cousin of Andrew Watson. So the project really benefited from Malik's own personal story, his family history, and all the academic research he has also done since discovering his heritage. Our project was jointly funded by the National Library of Scotland and by SLIC, the Scottish Library and Information Council. And I think it was seen as innovative by both the National Library and SLIC because it was not a co-curation project that was exhibition or display based. Many of the projects in the same vein that the library has done have tended to be, and innovative due to the extent and variety of our partnership work. So we partnered with the Scottish FA, the Scottish Football Museum, Show Racism, the Red Card, and Malik's productions company, Yesternight Productions. But in addition, we had this wider external network of supporters and organisations who steered and shaped the project with us and helped us hold it up. So there were colleagues at Glasgow Museums, University of Glasgow Special Collections 2, the West of Scotland Regional Equality Council, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, the Youth Community Support Agency, Burnhill Football Club, and we had a number of football historians who also helped with our work. And I can't kind of emphasize enough how important that wider external network was. And here is the team all assembled, our community curators lined up on the pitch at Hampden with our facilitators, and then Patrick and I as the library curators. So especially for the project, we recruited 2 external facilitators who came with a lot of experience of working in Glasgow, in football, with community groups, and on the subject of race and racism in sport. So our group, there were 13 in total, aged 18 to 25, and they were drawn from underrepresented and minoritized communities across Glasgow. They each received a grant of £45 for every 3-hour workshop, either in cash or in voucher form, depending on their refugee status. Just to mention now of the nations represented across the group, we had Pakistan, Nigeria, Angola, Portugal, Sudan, Somalia, Scotland, and England. And as you can see from the picture there, we had 8 women and 5 men, and we were absolutely delighted with that balance. We wondered whether football may not garner as much interest from women and girls as it did, but it definitely did. Now, just to kind of zoom you forward to the main result, the final output of all of our community curators' work. And here is a preview. Our end result was, one of them, a digital resource, which is going live in a few weeks' time, later in the summer. And what you can see here are 2 images from the resource, part of the home page, and then part of our kind of team lineup designed in a football card format. So working with the group, we put together this fantasy all-star team of footballers who played in Scotland or for Scotland to celebrate the rich history of sporting achievement, as well as to explore the impact of empire, racism, and prejudice. So you just get an idea from the images here of the time periods represented. Our team is trans-historical. The most recent player is Ifeoma Dieke, who you can see at the bottom there. And then we begin with Andrew Watson as the first, and he was mostly playing in the 1870s, image from the resource before I go back into the kind of process that we followed to get here. So here are some of our players, and you'll note the undiscovered talent in the middle there. That was very interesting discussions that led to the creation of that position on the team, and we could maybe come back to that in the questions if anybody is interested. So to get to that final result and represent all of the community curators' work and ideas, we held a series of 11 workshops at the library's Kelvin Hall building in Glasgow. They were held fortnightly and divided into several stages, as you can see from my screen. We had a first half and a second half, divided by a break at half time, final whistle, of course, and then a warm down kind of phase. We had involved kind of external visits, guest speakers, special activities, but mostly the workshops were based around reflection, discussion, and library collection items, with lots and lots of space to take things in a spontaneous, serendipitous directions as and when we felt that was required. We worked with our facilitators to, of course, structure activities within that. And as Patrick was talking there, I just remembered that one of the early activities we did was to get every member of our group to write down what communities they felt they belonged to. And then everybody did it, Patrick and I and our facilitators, and then we shared those lists with each other. And I felt that was quite a key moment in exploring the idea of the community we were creating and what it meant early on in the project. So just a quick note on our collections. One of the things that every single member of the community curator team did was that they reflected back to us the strictures, the possibilities, the privileges, the plenitude, and the deficits of the National Library's collections and the National Library itself. So we had, you can imagine the hundreds of thousands of football items and slavery and empire items that we had to draw on for the group. But nevertheless, we discovered gaps and omissions as we worked with them. One of the other things that made this project possible, that gave rise to our final product of the digital resource, and that made the project a success, was a program of social activities. It was a kind of naturally arising organic program that we put together during the course of the workshops. It wasn't pre-planned, and it really benefited from our facilitators' input and from the support of our partners. So we took our group to women's matches at Hampden Park, to the Glasgow Film Theatre. We ran special screenings, we did some pickleball, and all of that really embedded space for bonding, for conversations that could happen outside the workshop structure, where we got to meet our participants on a more neutral ground, on their own terms perhaps. We got to meet their friends and their family. And I think without that programme of social activities, the project would have been a great deal lesser. Now, to end this project overview, I'll just run through some of our results and mention the post-match feedback that we collected. So we were very fortunate with our group of community curators and their dedication to the project, and 12 out of 13 participants attended the vast majority of the sessions. We were also able to establish lots of new partnerships and connections through the work, and now we are embedded in new sporting networks activities across Glasgow, but also actually increasingly across the UK, which is really brilliant. As you can imagine, the administrative layer to this project was quite complicated, and as a result of working through that, for a project of this scale and duration, we have really developed the National Library's co-curation practices. And there would maybe be another whole part of the discussion where we could delve into that a bit more. And if anybody's interested, we can talk about that afterwards. We also were delighted that the SFA, the Scottish Football Association, established a women's social footballing coaching programme aimed at minorities to support women and the development of the women's game in Scotland, and that came directly out of conversations which were had during our workshops. One strand to the project was career skills, CV advice, and professional development. And as a result of that, we have one community curator already into employment in the cultural heritage sector. And that was a really wonderful and unforeseen result. So there were all of those things that layered and layered onto what the project was able to generate. Throughout our work, we left a lot of space for feedback, and we were, I think, always inviting and modifying the project after kind of informal chats with the curators. But at the end, we did do a formal feedback gathering session, and we got some really interesting reflections. And I think we are going to come back to some of those in the third part of this talk, which I will move into now. I wonder how we're doing for time. Okay, not too badly. So that was a really brief overview. I hope that it cohered. Going back to the beginning and now perhaps bringing together Patrick's reflections on community and the nitty-gritty of the project itself. In developing our work, what was really important for us was the model of a project that the National Museum's Liverpool Walker Art Gallery ran in 2022. We were really fortunate to meet the curator, Alex Patterson, who ran that project, and it provided us with a broad template for our work, as well as numerous practical tips. And Alex spoke very deeply and meaningfully about putting together her project's steering group, how she wanted to allow for multiple narratives in her project, and how she wanted to create an environment that was inclined to questioning National Museums Liverpool's way of working and to interrogating the sculpture collection there. So Alex had drawn very broadly from Liverpool's communities, bringing together people from lots and lots of different backgrounds. And I think Patrick and I were reflecting on that was when community happened in this project. It was the differences that allowed for that sense of community to be built. Also, before I move on slightly and hand back to Patrick, we felt that the term that Alex and the Walker Art Gallery used, the term steering group, was particularly interesting and right for the work that she was undertaking. And while we called our community curators, actually steering group more accurately reflects the role of the community curators, and it gives it it carries with it certain kind of connotations that are maybe less patronizing, and just express a bit more fully what the role of the group was, without giving a false impression that they were doing more than they were, or more importantly, less than they were. And on that point, just before I hand back to Patrick, one of our community curators, Javaria, was key in thinking about how the project was being steered and interrogated and influenced and questioned. It was quite early on in the workshop series that she started asking us what this was all for, why we were doing what we were doing, where we were going with this thing, and really in a very open way put the pressure on us a bit to think about expectations were, and also to acknowledge how high the community curators' expectations were too, and what they could really do and achieve, and maybe ways that we were beginning to slide into fudging that or misrepresenting in some way. And on that note, over to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Dora. Yes, just to sort of follow on really from that and build on that. I think it was in the moments of perhaps not conflict, but challenge and disagreement that we felt, and I think the majority of the community curators felt too, that it really felt like community was emerging, was coming out. You sort of felt it. So there was a moment, I think roughly halfway through the project, where the group really sort of took over the discussion, and it felt like we'd got to that point where it wasn't owned anymore by anybody, in perhaps a slightly utopian provisional sense, but still a real sense. And one of the there was a lot of debate in the group, which I think we perhaps hadn't foreseen, around questions of blackness and distinctions between genetics and culture, that I think, certainly speaking for myself, I felt at times quite uncomfortable about, and certainly would have felt uncomfortable intervening in, but that the group sort of took up and ran with and discussed and disagreed about. But in the middle of these discussions, there was a moment where Delight, one of the community curators, just, of his own accord, just stepped up to the board, started drawing out sort of diagrams, working out sort of what he was seeing as sort of degrees of blackness of Andrew Watson and his various members of his family, and it was there that suddenly something new was happening. The group had some very difficult, stimulating, thought-provoking discussions around colorism, in particular, the extent to which Andrew Watson would have been regarded and treated as black by his contemporaries, and how this would have influenced the treatment he received in various situations. There were also often quite tense, in one particular case, quite tense discussions around how to deal with legacies of empire and slavery, and whether these should be foregrounded, in particular in the Andrew Watson's 11 online resource, or left in the background so that the resource was more of a celebration. And we saw that conversations could happen within the group, that the curators hadn't perhaps had much chance to have elsewhere. It was absolutely key that we had skilled facilitators there. So there was and also had lots of breakout spaces, lots of areas that people go into, cool down. So after a disagreement that did become heated, but was never, I think, uncivil, the participants could go away, could talk about what had happened with facilitators, with ourselves as curators. And I think it's the other thing to say, to tie this back to the question of community, I think, and thinking again of the Palestinian student who challenged me at the conference, is thinking about the importance of this being a national resource that will sort of intervene in however small a way into public discourse. I'll wrap up. I realize we've been running on, but I think very briefly, and we hope you'll have some questions and we can talk more about this. But what really emerged is the importance of space and time for the kind of informal, unofficial discussions that take place outside and beyond the programmed activities of a project. And we really felt that it was in those moments and spaces, in the social sort of activities, but also in the sort of gaps between before and after those activities, that we got something like a Esposito's sense, perhaps, of community kind of breaking out. So I think, to conclude, if building communities really is what makes a library great, then we really need to be clear what we mean by community. It's not entirely clear, I think, certainly to me, to us, perhaps how libraries can build communities, but I think they can provide some of the metaphorical bricks and mortar for others to do so. Maybe thinking in something like Esposito's terms shows that libraries bring community into being by enabling encounters with those most outside the library, those most likely to be alienated from it. I think for us and some of our community curators, it was a transformational experience. But Esposito talks about this kind of feeling of community always being fleeting. It always happens on the way to becoming something else. It's not something sort of solid and enduring. So he says there's a kind of melancholy to it. We have continuing relationships with the community curators. One has become a professional colleague, others have become football teammates, some have moved on to university studies, and we remain in contact with them. But I think we miss that feeling of community we had with them all. And several of them have told us that they also miss it. But I think we have been transformed by it, as we hope have they, if perhaps in slightly more modest ways. And perhaps we'll wrap up there.
Great, thank you very much both for this fascinating presentation. I think that was a really wonderful point to finish on, to transformed through this work. Yeah, we do have. Please do keep up sending us your questions. Just I would like to just start before I go to the questions that we have. It's about maybe you could if you could reflect on more on that transformation, like from how do you plan to take these the lessons learned from that project, especially around the community and how contested this term can be to other initiatives within the library.
Dora, do you want to take that? Shall I?
Want to begin, and then we can.
Yeah. So I think part of it is it's as maybe this presentation makes clear, it's made us ask a lot of questions about how we work and how we think about community. And I certainly don't feel like we have answers, or certainly not final answers, but it's a better place to be in, I think, to be going in thinking really consciously about, okay, we talk about community, but what are we really getting at with it? We are looking at running a second season of the Football Research Club. And we have written an internal report, which I think Dora alluded to, of really detailing the lessons we've learned, which really gets into the granular detail around things like providing grants to participants who, because of their asylum seeking status, may not be able to receive payments. And so I think it's feeding into our ongoing work in all kinds of ways. Dora, anything?
Yeah, I think that's it. We've put several irons in the fire and have made things shift a bit here at the library. And we've been working on some potential ideas that we might do with partners, I suppose funding permitting, but maybe funding is a whole other conversation. But this work has made us think about what we can do community-wise without lots of money, and maybe the less money you have, sometimes the freer you might be able to be.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting given the current economic situation that many institutions are within. It's very important to hear that we can do lots of things to engage with a variety of user groups and communities with little money. That's very, yeah, hopeful to hear. Let me go now to some of the questions from our audience. So we've got one around what was the catalyst for the project and how did you recruit the interest of the volunteers?
The catalyst for the project, in one sense, I think, was the digitization for the Europeana Sport project of a sporting annual from the late 19th century that features Andrew Watson. That was the very initial spark that got us really thinking about, okay, we have this wonderful collection item, it's now digitized as well. How do we get the communities, I'm going to say it, who might be most interested in this particular collection item, aware of it and thinking about it, and what lessons can we get from them about what we should be doing with this particular collection item. And from that we started thinking about, okay, our collections much more broadly. The next sort of major catalyst was our first conversations with Malik, and his energy, his engagement, his willingness to challenge us and the library, and not to take no, or well, maybe, but it's going to be difficult for an answer. But to really push. And yeah, Malik as co-curator was absolutely vital to the project.
There was a third catalyst, which was the racism and sport conference you went to, Patrick. Yeah. And you came away with the message that we have to stop talking about doing the work and actually just do the work.
Yeah, that came across very powerfully at that conference, that it's, yes, it's never going to be perfect. We still need to learn a lot of lessons, but we need to get on with it. There's no excuses at this point.
Great, very much for the thank you very much for the answer. So I will go to another one, which is really I will try to put it more generally around partnership. So there was a question about whether any academic library involved, and just I would like to combine it with a question about how important was to choose the right partners for this project, especially when you want at the same time to challenge or push the boundaries of what we understand as a community at the moment.
Yes, there weren't any other academic partners involved, and I think the library has done National Library has done so much work with universities and academic partners, other research bodies and organizations, that wasn't the that wasn't going to characterize the partnerships that this project put in place. And the partnerships that we did have were absolutely crucial to the whole thing. So the partnerships you have are just all important. And I think what we could have maybe said a bit more about was the individuals that we worked with within those partner organizations and how influential they were and their own professional and personal networks in Glasgow. Often the National Library of Scotland's work tends to be quite Edinburgh based. And while we have a Glasgow building, our networks aren't quite as well developed. There hasn't been such a long kind of library presence in Glasgow, so we really, really benefited from how well our partners and the staff within them knew Glasgow and the people that we were working with. Maybe Patrick, you can say a bit more about.
I suppose the one sort of library adjacent academic partner was University of Glasgow Business Archives, were, again, as Dora mentioned in her talk, they were incredibly supportive. I think we both feel we would have liked to have worked a bit more closely with them, and they for example have the University of Glasgow documents that record Andrew Watson's enrolment. Again, one thing we learned on the project is you're probably going to be able to get in much less than you think you can, and that was something that just sort of fell by the wayside. We'd have liked to take the group and have them see the archive for themselves, but that relationship has sort of fed into the online resource and fed into the project. So that was one sort of academic partnership, I suppose, that it wasn't in a sense a formal partnership, but I think that was one thing about the project, is that we had the core partners, but we also had a much wider, more diffuse, sort of organically emerging network of contacts and allies who were universally wonderful in the support they provided.
Great, thank you very much. So we have time for a couple of questions, and so another one is about so you mentioned so a colleague says that you mentioned community was breaking out. Can you please tell more about it, and of course, and also what was your favorite part of the project?
Yeah, I'll try and talk a bit about this idea of sort of community breaking out. It's, again, as I said, Esposito, I think, is a difficult thinker and somebody I'm still sort of struggling with and struggling to be certain that I've really understood. But my understanding at the moment of his argument is that community. He talks a lot about how our sort of current understanding of community as emerging from something we have in common is really a sort of Anglo-centric idea of community that comes out of American neo-communitarianism. And in that model, he says, well, you have the sort of liberal idea of the individual who's sort of enclosed within himself, and it's probably the right pronoun to use in this case. And what the kind of common model we have of community really entails is just sort of extending that kind of fenced in, and he uses the word enclosure with sort of all the connotations that come with that. Is just we just sort of extend that to a group rather than an individual, but it becomes still about kind of fencing in the group and defending it from external threats. So he's very interested in sort of Foucault and biopolitics and this idea of sort of immunization of the group from sort of infection from outside. So the model he's trying to build is one that gets rid of those sort of boundaries to the group. That is exactly about, community happens when we let those down, when we sort of surrender our pre-existing group identities, perhaps, and in a sort of sharing of difference, which I suspect is a phrase he'd hate, but I hope that sort of perhaps gives a hint of what he's trying to convey.
Great. So thank you very much. And about your what was your favorite part of the project?
Dora, do you want?
Yeah, I mean it was the strand running through it of that kind of combination of resistance or kind of questioning from the group and kind of enthusiasm and motivation. So it was the balance between those two things.
I think it's very similar for me. I think it was this sense of real connections emerging in moments of disagreement, questioning, sort of pushing at our assumptions and expectations. That all those moments, and some of them were fraught occasionally, but they always seem to result in more of a community, in making a community that it wasn't there in the first one or two workshops. It was something that got built up over the course of the project, so that I think we do feel very closely connected, or have a genuine feeling of community towards the whole group.
Yeah, that's great to hear. It sounds, although it can be challenging at times, these challenging situations can also be the most rewarding and just help build these connections with other people. And a last question. So Ellen says, thank you for sharing this excellent work. Were the community curators themselves comfortable with the term community in their position title? Did they use it themselves in English or in other languages?
We talked about it. I think we weren't sure, and we wanted to give them the chance to decide what term they felt should be used, and we gave them the option. We did say, if you want to be described in a different way, and I think we did suggest some alternatives. Looking back, I don't know if you'd agree, Dora, but I feel perhaps most of the group weren't really, when we tried to offer that sort of choice, that option, they were too unsure of the connotations of alternatives and of community. It wasn't something, I think in retrospect, we probably needed to have a much more sort of thoroughgoing discussion of what that might mean. And I think, again, one of those lessons of the project was the time is going to go really quickly.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that just sort of fell by the wayside a bit. It would have been really interesting to talk with them about community and what it, in a bit more detail. I mean, Dora, you talked about the sort of exercise right at the start where everybody did talk about the different communities they belong to. Perhaps there was a missed chance to sort of follow up on that, but again, there was so much happening all the time.
If we do this, well, when we continue to do the work, I think we will follow up again and keep in mind the Walker Art Gallery's steering group take on it as well.